Hello and welcome to Crown Bees. It is World Bee Day. Happy World Bee Day, and welcome to our online live uh, presentation, Buzzing with Diversity. So right now I would like to introduce the founder and owner of Crown Bees, and he's also the author of The Mason Bee Revolution, and I will link that below. In 2008, Dave started Crown Bees literally out of his garage. I will share a picture later. And he grew the company set into setting the standard for the best practices in raising solitary bees through collaborations with farmers, gardeners, and researchers. Hi, Dave.
Gosh, that's embarrassing. Thanks, Julie. So this is a get to do for us. That this is a day where you can say, it's all about bees. And I know there's a lot of messes out there. What's going right and what's going wrong. But the fun thing is to be able to celebrate with some experts in their own arena. So, Julie, if you could also bring in our other panelists. We're honored to have different people and friends. So you heard about me. Margarita, tell us a little bit about who you are and where you're located, please.
Yeah, well, thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to this discussion in the next hour. I'm Margarita López-Uribe. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Entomology at Penn State University. I am an evolutionary biologist, entomologist, and a melitologist. I have been studying bees, conservation and sustainability for 20 plus years. And I have done work with many bees, but today I'm going to share about ground bees.
Love ground bees. They're everywhere. There's a lot
of
them. Brandon.
Hi, yeah, Brandon Hopkins. I'm in Pullman, Washington at Washington State University. And I work on honeybees and lots of different aspects of honeybees, but background in reproductive biology, but work a lot on commercial management practices now. I'm happy to be here.
And Aidan.
Yeah, I'm Aidan Hersh. I'm a macro photographer and soon to be a master's student also at Washington State University in Pullman. But for the time being, I'm in Bellingham. And I'm also a board member at the Washington Native Bee Society and an instructor with the Washington Bee Atlas. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay, so a whole bunch of different flavors. We also, there's more bees than we're going to bring up here today, but what we thought would be fun would be to have people show some of the pictures and backgrounds of some of these wonderful bees. Margarita, why don't you go first, share some videos and pictures and kind of talk us through ground nesting.
Okay, wonderful. Let's see how this goes. Okay, are you guys seeing my slides? Not yet. Okay, now? Yes. Okay, wonderful. I guess since I am the first one, I'm just going to provide a little bit of a brief introduction about, why we're separating ourselves into, providing information about different types of bees. There are about 20,000 species of bees worldwide. And that diversity, of course, is equated with diversity of different behaviors, ecologies, social behaviors. And even though we are most familiar with honeybees as, this association, honeybees are social and they produce honey, the reality is that the majority of bees are actually ground nesting bees. So today in the next 5 minutes, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about, who these bees are. I'm going to show you some photos and videos about what they do. And hopefully that will, add to your knowledge about these, wonderful group of bees. So here on the right of the slide, I just have some photos of, some bees, some different types of bees. We have here a bumblebee. We're going to hear from Aidan about them. This is an orchid bee. This is a neotropical bee. These bees are super cool. They come in all sorts of colors from, blue, red, green. I'm going to talk about these squash bees in a little bit because this is my favorite type of bee and the one that we study the most in my group. This is a ground nesting bee. And this one as well, this is a cellophane bee and a mining bee. So as you can see, they are very, very diverse. So I wanted to start with some facts about ground nesting bees. As I said, the majority of bees have this nesting habitat. About 70% of them nest underground, and they're solitary. So that means that there is only one female in each of the nests. Here you can see some photos of these ground nesting bees. So this is what you see from the outside, right? You see kind of like what, if you don't see the bee poking her head at the entrance of the nest, you would just see kind of a pile of dirt, and it could look like an ant nest, right? But a lot of bees actually have this nesting habit. When we think evolutionarily, this is the ancestral state of bees. So the first bees in their evolutionary history were ground nesters, and this is similar to the nesting habitats of their relatives, which are sphesid wasps. They also build nests underground. Even though we don't hear about them a lot, they are very important crop pollinators. These mining bees, cellophane bees, and sweat bees are all important pollinators of different types of crops. We have important orchard pollinators. Some are important pollinators of blueberries, and even some of the summer crops like pumpkins. Something that is very interesting and we as scientists don't understand very well are the specific nesting requirements. So there is a lot of soil, right, on kind of like terrestrial habitats, but bees are very choosy about where to nest. And so the type of soil, how much sun they receive, the vegetation around their nests actually is important. And it is somehow associated with the choices that bees make about where to nest. And something else that is interesting is that a lot of these solitary ground nesting bees, even though they're solitary, they can live in large aggregations. And so it is not uncommon to find dozens or even like thousands of nests, like next to each other. And when you see these nests in aggregation and all the bees flying around, it can give you kind of a feeling that you're in the middle of a honeybee swarm, because there can be a lot of bees in these nest aggregations. So this is a photo of how they look like, when, again, if you're walking on a lawn or something. So all of these holes here are actually nests of ground nesting bees, as you can see, there are many, many, many in just a tiny area. And I wanted to show you a video of how they dig, right? So again, we often don't think about bees, digging underground. These are cellophane bees, and I found these nest aggregation in a playground in Raleigh, North Carolina. And you can see, like they basically have to dig and take all of that dirt out. They build tunnels under the ground. And so you can imagine how much work it is for a little insect like this one to actually be excavating those cavities underground. It is very energetically expensive. And then they build these tunnels. And at the end of the tunnels, that's where they construct the cells, where they put all the pollen and nectar and lay their eggs. All of this is happening underground. Dave asked me to present and talk about my favorite bee. And so I wanted to just spend maybe, like a minute talking about these bees and why they are my favorite bee. My favorite bees are the squash bees. These are extremely cool bees. Again, they're kind of unique and rare because instead of like using and taking advantage of all the pollen availability in a habitat, they have these very unique, super specialized diets. So they only collect the pollen from one plant genus, which is the genus Cucurbita, which happens to be a very important crop. So these are the squash bees, and they are in a pumpkin flower here. You can see that bee, that female with, some pollen on her face. And here you can see a bee leg with all of that huge pumpkin pollen attached to the scopa. And this is where they transport the pollen. And yeah, that makes them really important pollinators for agriculture because they pollinate all of our pumpkin crops. These bees are ground nesting and they nest in aggregations. This is kind of a terrible video, but it gives you an idea of how dense they can form aggregations. And this is next to a pumpkin farm, right? So you can see all of those bees, flying around and all of those piles of dirt on the ground are individual bee nests that are, taking place next to the crops. So it looks a little bit like some of the nomia bees that are used for alfalfa pollination in the West Coast. So, well, that's it. I guess I would be happy to answer any questions later. Okay, let me see. I need to stop sharing. How do I do that? Stop sharing. Dave, I think you're muted.
I was muted the entire time. Sorry. Hey, Brandon, let's go. Let's go learn about what everyone thinks all bees are. So give us an overview of a honeybee and show us the secrets of success. Okay.
Okay, the secrets of success. I didn't know we had a year or two to be on this show here, but I don't know if I have any secrets. But yeah, I mean, a lot of people think of honeybees when they think of bees, which, in some ways is kind of unfortunate, but it's a nice model because it's one that we manage and tightly control. And so we get to see a lot of the stresses that affect other bees in a much more maybe upfront and in our face kind of way. So all those same sort of difficulties of lack of forage and nutrition and pest pressures and environmental issues that all these other bees face, honeybees experience the same way, but we have, multi-billion-dollar industry dependent on them. So, we get to the benefit of having lots of examples and ability to manipulate them in really cool and exciting ways. I tried to put together a few pictures, so I'll go through that just so that we have something to talk about, and then and see where it goes from there. I'll see if I can share this thing really quick. And I do have to apologize. I kind of just tried to throw some in here last minute as we were talking. So, and because it's World Bee Day, I figured I would share the entire screen. It might be easier just to share a whole screen. Okay. Does that work? Can you guys see it?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah, so I work with managed bees and a lot of times big commercial operations. But I have had the opportunity to see bees in their native range. So we talk about native bees, especially here in the US, excludes these honeybees, the Western honeybee that we know, but in their native range, they are also highly diverse, which is very cool and exciting. And so this is a bee. I'll go one more picture. So this is a beekeeper in Kazakhstan, right near the Tian Shan Mountains. So this is a subspecies Apis mellifera pomonella that would have co-evolved in these native apple forests and cherry forests where a lot of these tree fruits that we have now originated on this border between Kazakhstan and China and Kyrgyzstan. And so sometimes called like the Tian Shan gray bee. This is a picture of one of these bees kind of up close, and you can see like sort of gray hairs on the body. What was that?
Not as yellow as what?
Not quite as yellow. Yeah, they're a dark bee, like a lot of these sort of mountainous subspecies tend to be. I've had the pleasure of working with some people from other places. This is a Wardia Kessie from Algeria who came to the lab and is wearing a bee beard here. And so is interesting to see beekeeping in some of these other countries. And so we got to go visit her in Algeria. And so this is a bee yard on the right and a honey house in Algeria that we got to visit. Let's see. Oh, this was a video. I don't know if the sound works, but these are some hives in Slovenia. So these are these sort of Slovenian style hives where you work the colony from the back, and that's Dr. Shepard. They're collecting drones at the entrance. And this is at a bee breeder's house where you can see some nucleus colonies there outside the main colonies. Sorry, let's see. So this is another view of those sort of style of beekeeping. It's very cool, intricate. It's almost like furniture. It's so finely kept. And then I did want to say, so a lot of there's these conservation efforts here in the United States, especially surrounding these native bees. And it's interesting because if you go over to France, for example, where this place was, it's a conservation group to save the native bee in the region of France, the Apis mellifera, or the black bee of Europe, because it's been largely displaced by beekeepers who have favored other subspecies. And so there's these conservation groups attempting to preserve this particular subspecies in its native range. And so this is an example on the island of Groix, where there are these wild hives living in this fortification, an old fort on this island that has holes in the wall. And so we're collecting drones from colonies that live in this old fort wall. Cool. That was that's what I could throw together really quick, pulling stuff out of my timeline. Let's see.
That's awesome, Brandon. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the main thing I just wanted to share was, since it was World Bee Day, is that there are, kind of an amazing amount of diversity even within this one species of bee that have, vastly different characteristics, and in the United States, probably, widely underutilized as far as breeding practices and things like that, and having a species that's adaptable for different uses, but also just within a changing environment as well.
Thank you. Okay, so Aidan, photographer. I've set the bar really high. Show us some of your bees that you just think are cool.
Sure.
Pictures of, and then while you're at it, tell us what we're looking at. So it'll be kind of fun.
Yeah. So I'll be talking about bumblebees because those are the bees that kind of got me into entomology as a career path. And so, yeah, there are a lot of bumblebees in Washington, which is lucky for me and for everybody else that lives here. And there's some very obvious, like, endearing traits about them. Like they're just fuzzy, they're big, they're generally docile. And so quite often I let them hang out on my finger and take pictures, especially when it's cold out and they need some extra warmth. They're more than happy to just hang out on your hand and absorb some of that body heat. But the real reason that I really got into bumblebees and why they struck a chord with me was when I was on a road trip in Alaska, and it was the summer, which isn't super long up there, obviously, and everywhere I went, there was fireweed blooming, and everywhere there was fireweed, there were bumblebees, even in some pretty extreme environments, like high altitude, places that otherwise did not look very hospitable for bees. And this is one of the bees that I found on the fireweed there. And so places like this where in the winter, this is just completely inundated in snow or ice. And then you have the short period in the summer when all the wildflowers bloom, and then all of the colonies of bumblebees still form and go out and forage. And it was just fascinating to me. And here's another example. This is a video of a place that I was hiking that ended up at a massive ice field. And yet, even among all of the scree and rocks, there was just a little bit of fireweed with bumblebees foraging on it in the rain. And so I think that sort of just their adaptability and their let's not watch that again. Just their ability to exist in all of these crazy habitats, being cold adapted and existing in these places like Alaska was fascinating. Yeah, and so in the Pacific Northwest, we have over 20 species of bumblebees, and that's more than half of all of them in North America. And this one is Bombus vosnesenskyii, which I'm sure many people are familiar with because it's one of the more common ones in Washington. And we have some like this one, Bombus occidentalis, that are in serious decline, at least in terms of their normal range. And um, another one is this one, Bombus flavifrons. This is an anacortes in Western Washington. This is one of the more common ones that you'll see around here. But yeah, just a few of the bees that exist in Western Washington that are part of the like massive diversity of bumblebees in this area. And yeah, it's I'm thankful to be living in a place like this where I'm able to experience that type of diversity. So yeah, that's my spiel about bumblebees.
Okay, so what bees did we not talk about? Margarita, I'm going to pick on you.
Yeah, many. So okay, so maybe let's do kind of like
Malacopa.
broad. Yeah. So well, there are 7 families of bees, like big groups of bees. 6 of them are in North America. And a lot of them are ground nesting bees, but of the most common ones, yes, we didn't talk about small or large carpenter bees. We didn't talk about cuckoo bees, which are probably between like 20-25% of all bee biodiversity are cuckoo bees.
Okay, a cuckoo bee does what?
A
Comparison
cuckoo,
to the hardworking bees.
yeah. So the cuckoo bees don't build any nests, don't collect any pollen or nectar. They use another species nests to lay their eggs. So, yeah,
Kleptoparasite?
kleptoparasites, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'm trying to think what else. Aidan and Brandon, am I
And we didn't
missing?
talk about cavity nesters. I think.
Yes, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, of course.
And I mean, even
Yeah.
on the subject of cuckoo bees, you have social cuckoo bees as well. So
True.
like the
Okay. Where's
like
a social cuckoo bee?
so bumblebees, like there are a subset of bumblebees in the genus Cytherus or subgenus Cytherus that kind of go into established bumblebee nests and oust the queen, and then
That's awesome.
they use the workers that she basically raised to now raise the young of the cuckoo bumblebee. So yeah, one of the more endangered, like the most endangered species of bee in this area, Bombus sucklei, is a cuckoo bee, but it's very, very, very rare now.
Okay, and Brandon, you didn't mention killer bees. Ooh, yeah.
I didn't. Yeah, I did mention that there are a lot of subspecies of these western honeybees, and so the Africanized or killer bee, as people would call them, are just one of those subspecies, and they too have very valuable and interesting characteristics that make that subspecies unique, and so the aggressive behavior that they're sort of famous for here is just one of those characteristics, but they have very interesting and other characteristics as well.
Okay. So any other species that we're missing? I mean, obviously, and you've
Yeah.
got blends of eusocial, and I mean, there's a lot of. What is the biggest bee? Wasn't that down in South America? Something that burrows into a termite pile?
So no, the largest bee is Megachile Pluto, and I think it is found in Africa. It's a megachilid, so it's like the leaf. It's a leaf. It looks like a leaf cutter, leaf cutting bee.
So this big?
Yes,
Yeah.
and huge jaws. Right? It's ginormous.
Okay, and to the opposite end, Perdido, is that the
Perdita minima. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. So the appreciation, there's an awful lot of bees out there. Okay. Shifting into I always want to finish on positive. So first of all, what's going wrong? I'm going to say out of the 4 places that I think things are going wrong, if there's habitat, climate change, pesticides, and diseases and pests, are those the 4 major pieces?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I think the one that people have the most control over, like individually, is habitat loss and fragmentation, just since we've divided up, like urban areas into individual pieces of land, right? So if people are able to plant habitat that is friendly for bees, that's something that people have the most control over. But
Well, and Aidan, we don't realize, like, when I put my thousands of acres of apple trees, one species or one variety of trees forever, what used to be there was a potpourri of something always showing up all year long. And now that you've replaced all of that with just one for 2 weeks, right? There's because I think people think more of, I mean, they think more of a house and roads, have taken out, but it's the agriculture, I think, that's done.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, like, Brandon can probably speak to this living in the Police Prairie, but like, I went and visited there a few weeks ago, and like, it's a beautiful habitat, but at the same time, like, the scale of the habitat destruction from agriculture is like massive. Like that the prairie in that area was, when you visit there and drive through it, you see these rolling hills. It looks like it was just it's almost like an ocean frozen, like a snapshot of all these like rolling waves of hills. But it's all like, monoculture at this point, and it used to be rolling prairie full of wildflowers and yeah, so
Yeah, and I think, I mean, to add a little bit to that, I mean, not only that's certainly a part of it, but I think it's maybe been made worse just by changes in farming practices as well. So, I mean, I think they've had these large monocultures here on the Palouse for a long time, but I think things have been worse. I mean, you have just these simple little things that start adding up, like the ability to tile ground and drain it is a lot easier than it used to be, right? Because you can just rent big machines and tile it. And so areas that were too wet and swampy to farm were full of weeds and habitat that these bees could survive on, that are now farmable because they could drag tile through it really quick. And like one example I saw.
Wait, Brandon, back up. Brandon,
Yeah.
when you say tile, I don't understand that word.
Oh, it's like a way of dragging drain pipe. Like you can think of it as like pulling drainage pipe underground, and so then the water runs out of that area, so it's not so wet and swampy. So it allows you to take ground that's too wet and swampy, and you drain the water out of that place, so that then you could farm it. So it just speeds up the drainage and gets the water out of the field so that you can then farm that ground.
Be destructive to your ground nesters.
Yeah, that too, right? And then there's what used to be weeds and flowering plants and things like that are now able to plant in wheat or whatever it is. And another example in North Dakota, it was called the shelter belt capital of the world. I saw it on like these big billboards and stuff. They were very proud of these shelter belts, which are just big trees, big wind blocks that they would plant, these big poplar trees or whatever they were. And so driving around with an old farmer guy out there, we saw them actively like cutting these trees down. And he told me that this like new generation just considered those trees to be like giant weeds, and that it was the ground that they could farm, right? Like, why are we growing these big rows of trees and stuff? And we could be planting that and making a little money. And then back a few years later, I mean, maybe it was just coincidence, but they had just had a huge windstorm, and there were all these center pivot irrigation sprinklers, like upside down with the wheels up in the air. Like everywhere we drove, there were, I don't know, bunches of them. I mean, they had to have been like, $200,000 sprinklers, all twisted and bent and torn up. And so that guy was kind of saying, like, now maybe they see why we had these shelter belts out here in North Dakota. And so I think so I mean, it's just the removal of these habitats and trying to farm every single square inch possible. No more fences, no more fence rows where all these weedy sort of flowering plants could have, used to grow alongside these monocultures.
Yeah, and I do think that's like a crucial point, is like it's not it's important to remember that like it's possible to exist simultaneously and like in harmony with a lot of the natural world, and that the methods that we've begun to use in order to use agriculture, are definitely part of the problem. Like you can have agriculture and you can have managed species, whether that's plant or animal, and still live somewhat in harmony with natural beings. But when it comes to like monocultures and just like total like raising of the land for things like that, like you're describing, then yeah, it's not going to go great.
And even a missed piece is when the backyard gardener goes out to their yard and says, "Oh my gosh, look, I've got all these beautiful flowers, everyone," and most of them are sterile hybrids that look beautiful, smell good, and as they got them from whatever store, the store doesn't want you raising these flowers yourself. They want to sell you flowers every single year, so they're all sterile hybrids. Okay, and I'm asking the researchers, how useful is a hybrid flower to a bee?
I think it probably depends, but we've done some work with crop domestication and how that impacts the attraction and nutrition of the flowers to bees. And like the flowers change significantly in how they smell, how they look, how watered down or rich the nectar and the pollen is, right? So anytime that we are modifying plants through selection, we are likely not thinking about bee attraction, right? Like we're thinking about the bees, the flowers should look, pretty or smell well, or we want bigger fruit or more sweeter, right? Like things to harvest. And of course that has impacted how, like this communication between plants and bees, like takes place.
Good one.
Can I add something about the stressors?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I agree with Aidan and Brandon that the habitat loss component is a major one, and is probably, it has been ongoing for decades now, right? And so I think habitat is basically being degraded, and floral diversity and habitat availability is just decreasing. But then, the way I think about the other stressors is that the lack of food and habitat is making bees more susceptible to other stressors, right? Because if you're not fed well, right, like this happens to us, if we're not, like if we don't have a good diet, then, like we're more susceptible to diseases, we're more susceptible to changes in climate, right? Like, so basically these ongoing habitat degradation for many decades is putting bees and pollinators, broadly speaking, in a position where they are more susceptible to other stressors that are ongoing. So they are all intertwined at the moment. That's, how I think about it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it forms just like a positive feedback loop of like, if there's fewer available floral resources, and then you start getting changes in phenology with climate change, then you're going to get bees emerging at times that there's no flowers. Yeah. So, and like, of course, changes in temperature are going to lead to certain pathogens spreading quicker, or just other pathogens just existing in the first place.
Let's drop into that, Aidan. Climate change. As I spoke to a couple of researchers a couple months ago about where did they think climate change was really impacting, and this is what I heard, is that it's your shoulder bees. So the bees, the issue can be that the phenology, the interaction between pollinator and plant is out of whack, and so in the early spring you've got trees or bushes showing up later or earlier in bees. So the shoulder bee is that spring something, and then in the fall something that things are, disappearing faster than they need to. Is that your understanding?
Totally, yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people might not even know that there are, well, first of all, that there are 20,000 species of bees, but that a lot of those bees are specialists, and that they specialize on foraging from flowers of particular genera, or like it could be even specific species, like certain species. And so phenology, also for people that don't know, is essentially like the timeline of like the biological timeline of a species. So when a plant emerges, when it flowers, that sort of stuff. And so these bees, especially specialist bees, have been evolving like in tandem with these flowers. And so they, for millions of years or hundreds of thousands of years, have evolved to emerge at the same time that these flowers are flowering. And so when climate change is speeding up and happening at such a rate that is not natural, those things are also changing. And so you get mismatches in the phenology, right? So like where a bee emerges in March when it should be emerging in April, and maybe the flower doesn't follow in that step, and maybe it still emerges in April, and then that bee that specializes on that flower has no floral resources that it can use.
Yeah.
Try to adapt.
Yeah, and so I think that's the ecological consequences of climate change are definitely that's a concern. These mismatching phenology between plants and bees. I also think that even though we've done a lot of work with thermal tolerance of bees, and so trying to like understand, okay, how hot can it get for a bee before it collapses. And so in general, bees are quite heat tolerant. I mean, that's there's a lot of variation, but compared to other insects, they are quite heat tolerant. But for example, in the southwest of the U.S., right, the temperatures are definitely reaching what like adult bees can tolerate, right? So if like if you get to like 50 Celsius degrees for a desert bee, even for a desert bee, that's going to be reaching a point where they can probably is going to be lethal to go out foraging. So yeah, these these interactions are definitely important, even at the like the organismal bee level. And something else that we're finding with our research is that actually when they are infected with these pathogens, which are more common when the bees are not well fed, that also decreases the thermal tolerance of bees, right? So so again, this is how all of these stressors are interconnected, right? If the bees were healthy and didn't have any diseases, they would be able to withstand.
And the temperatures are fine. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, it's just kind of a very bad combination of stressors at the moment.
And in the bees that I play with, the Osmia lignaria, right around 80 degrees, these bees just can't fly. I mean, so they'll just sit inside their house waiting, and then in the mornings and the evenings they're active. But at that hard period, I just think their bodies just aren't acclimated to that hive piece. There was also, I don't know if you guys read the research out of University of Minnesota a couple of years ago. They were saying with these heat domes that are coming through, the physiology, the nectar and pollen from the plant wasn't beneficial to the larva. So, even then, so all the bees, all the eggs laid from the pollen and nectar gathered that day just wouldn't make it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think another really fascinating piece of research that is still like undergoing something that we're still learning about is with regard to pollen, but this time specifically like pesticides and fungicides, is that we're learning about what bee larvae actually metabolize, like what they feed on. And it's not just the pollen itself, it's not just the protein in the pollen, but it's also like the microorganisms that live on the pollen. And so we do a lot of testing of pesticides and herbicides and fungicides on, like, for example, honeybees. And if we see, oh, it didn't kill the honeybee, like it might not be a huge deal because it's not directly affecting it. But then you still get problems where, like, oh, these solitary bees aren't developing properly, but I thought we figured out that like these pesticides were not affecting them directly. But it turns out when you kill all of the microorganisms that live on the pollen, that those bee larvae are actually relying on that extra nutrition, or maybe it's even like protection from pathogens. And so like basically changing up all of these different little aspects of the way that bees operate have drastic effects, even if we don't really know at first, right? So like if you're killing these little tiny microorganisms that exist on the pollen, you're indirectly killing those bees as well, because they're not going to be able to develop properly.
Sean Stephan's lab out of Wisconsin had done a lot of this research. They said that osmias are omnivores, that they don't have the microbes in there, then they're, okay. And then a year later, they said, oh, shoot, when you spray fungicides in your orchards, you're knocking off the microbes. And so you're not impacting the bees that much, but you're impacting the progeny because they just...
Yeah. I mean, it's similar to like all of the pollen mites you find in the Osmia lignaria nests, like, right? They're not directly like eating the bees or killing the bees, but they're eating all of their pollen provisions, and so then they have nothing to eat. Yeah. And I don't want to obviously just make this so depressing, but going back to like climate change, one of the really interesting things also about that, especially somewhere in Washington where we have like a lot of subalpine habitat in the mountains and whatnot, is as the climate warms and that warming trend increases, you get like the snow level increases to higher elevations, and you get like trees encroaching in subalpine habitats. And I just went on like a trip with some rare plant botanists to see a plant that is endemic to like a single hillside in the Saddle Mountains in central Washington. And it literally exists like in a 50-meter, maybe like vertical strip of hillside. You get that change, like the snow level or like the tree lines can change that much. I mean, I'm not a climate scientist, but in a very relatively short amount of time, with like in the trend that we're taking right now, and you get bees that specialize on plants that live in such specific little ecological niches. And so when you get these changes in like the temperature that then affect the tree line and affect like the environment that these very specific plants are able to live, then you're changing up a lot of things.
How robust, Brandon, are the honeybees with climate change, with increased heat? Can they just turn on the fan a little more and off they go?
Yeah, they do have some advantage like that, right? Because they're this big social organism and they can heat and cool the colony to maintain the temperature. But they're not completely, resistant to those changes. So there are, cases in the southern states where you can have colonies die from sort of like heat exhaustion, basically, and beekeepers can, have to go to great lengths sometimes of putting up shade cloths to protect the colonies. Even, on big commercial operations, they have these massive shade cloths to cover the colonies. So sometimes when they're in pollination in those heat events, when it's 120 degrees. And also they have to divert a lot of their resources to gathering water instead of collecting, pollen and nectar. And so they're, less effective pollinators, and, obviously they're not bringing as much food resources if they're, having to run the swamp cooler all day collecting water. So, they are certainly impacted by that stuff. And, these are these like extreme weather events, but I was fortunate to be on a group. We just published some work on how even small changes like in autumn can cause sort of these like warmer fall conditions or warmer spring conditions that cause bees to forage at times when there is, say, no flowering plants. And so they're sort of out foraging without any great return. And that foraging, the bees age and die. I mean, whenever they're flying, they're dying, and they've only got, so many miles they can do. And so that can cause shifts in sort of the age structure of the colony as they overwinter, and makes them more susceptible to this condition called spring dwindling. And so those kind of, even small changes in the climate can affect the colony dynamics and make them more vulnerable to these.
Okay, so last negative piece here is okay, we've got to get to good news. Sure's got to be good news. Chemicals, pesticides, insecticides, larvicides, sides. Can we collectively just say sides aren't beneficial to insects?
I mean, I think it's always a little more nuanced than that. I mean, when you have problems that we've created, one of which obviously is the overuse of sides, but like they also to some degree play a part in fixing the mess we've made, right? Like when you have invasive species that we've brought to other places, sometimes using pesticides or herbicides are a part of the solution in a very like managed way. But like using herbicides or something to just like spray your lawn because you don't like a certain weed, like that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about like, oh, maybe you have like Himalayan blackberry completely destroying a habitat because it's been introduced there. But you might need to use herbicides in order to help eradicate that invasive species. Again, it's nuanced, and yeah, I'm interested what other people have to say about that.
Margarita, thoughts?
I agree with Aidan, and so I think part of the problem that we've created is the lack of biodiversity at different levels in agricultural systems, and this is what makes like pests really good at taking advantage of these ecosystems that are the plant structure in these agricultural settings are usually like one type of plant that has been genetically modified, is not as well protected chemically, genetically is very homogeneous, and so pests like thrive in that environment. Those are the plants that are giving food to humans, so we need to do something to protect the plants to keep agricultural production. So it is a challenge, because even though these sites are intended to like kill insects, right? They are needed to protect crops, but there are unintended consequences. And so I think the responsibility of like how to best use those pesticides, really the bottom line is that more is not better, right? And this sometimes is challenging, right? I think growers need to make a lot of difficult decisions about like how to save my like the production this year with all of these threats, and thinking that if I spray before something shows up, then this is going to be better. Lots of science supports that is not the case, but we need to like work with growers to like see changes in behavior in that sense. So yeah, I guess I agree that it's not as easy as everything is bad and we shouldn't use them, because we need pesticides, but we need to use them responsibly.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best answer, really, is that we need them, and we just need to be responsible. And so I think communication between the folks applying it and education and research is like critical to be able to use those chemicals in a responsible way. And they're not all bad, and some are necessary, especially when it comes to beekeeping. Beekeepers, it doesn't get talked about much, but the management of honeybees is reliant on the use of chemicals. And every time we look at pesticides in wax or pollen, in a honeybee hive, the top two chemicals found in every single analysis are all beekeeper applied pesticides. So coumaphos and fluvalinate are the top two in every single pesticide survey I think I've ever seen on hive. And so those are chemicals beekeepers have put in their hives. And so, as much as beekeepers, don't like, and insecticides and fungicides can certainly impact colony growth, the beekeepers themselves rely on these chemicals as well.
Okay, so let's now lighten up. So our viewers are backyard gardeners, or who knows who else is out there, but in my yard, I do nothing, and my lawn isn't perfectly green. I've got things showing up in it, and I slowly cut back a little bit of lawn every year and put a little something, and I do nothing, and I have aphids show up and then they get eaten. I have gray crawly things on my broccoli, and a week later they're just clean. Someone ate them. So I do nothing in my yard, and my yard is, I have holes. Okay, and I had this one. It's called a popcorn tree, poof, brilliant, thousands of big balls of popcorn. And then about 3 years ago, something showed up and denuded all of the flowers, everything just gone, poof. And the tree, you'd have a second generation of leaves. And the second year, the same thing again. The whole tree was just eaten, and it was only that tree. So rather than face this thing, I just took it out. And I don't have that issue with there anymore. And okay, so I'm in my yard, I just relax. Okay, there's my 2 cents. If we're talking about chemicals, what can people do? Backyard to consumer action, buying, labeled bee safe products. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I would say, and I think Margarita was kind of touching on this, especially when it comes to like agricultural practices. There's no room for like a loss in profits. Like you can't just have a bad year because that might mean the end of your company or something. And I think that unfortunately carries over into people's like mindsets of their own backyards, where it's like instead of taking the time to kind of get more in touch with their local ecosystem and use methods like Dave, you were mentioning, of just like
Nothing.
biocontrol really, instead of or like doing nothing, letting things take their natural course. People want to go buy a pesticide off the shelf and just like use that because it's more convenient. And so, yeah, I would say that there are pests, and then there in our sense of the word, and then there are also insects that consume those pests, like whether that be parasitic wasps or things like that. There are checks and balances, I guess, for lack of a better term, in nature that exist so that things don't get out of hand. And that's the best way, in my opinion, to like manage your own garden or your own yard, is to like understand where you exist, where like what your bioregion is, and what native plants and pollinators and predators live there, and kind of leverage that in order to maintain a healthy ecosystem.
Margarita, what do you think the labeling of products like a bee safe product, or whatever Xerces is putting out there, is that effective, do you think? And does that put enough stress on or strain onto the grower that they're able to lean into the marketing hype?
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent, right? Like those are mechanisms that are helping with some of the problems. I just came back from Michigan State, where we spent 3 days thinking about climate resilience of, like insects in agriculture. And the main conclusion that we reached is that one of the most powerful things that we can do is to try to help consumers change their preferences for what they consider, like something that they want to buy at the store. Even though some of the pesticide applications are driven by, like growers having to, keep their livelihoods that year, there is a huge component of it that is driven by the fact that if you don't have a perfect apple, or if you don't have a perfect cherry, the consumer is not going to buy that. And that actually is a huge part of what the growers need to do in terms of pesticide application, is driven by the fact that if you don't have that perfect apple, you are not gonna, like sell your product. So, I think as consumers, we need to kind of understand that insects are part of, like these systems. And so as you were saying, Dave, right, you may have, like your broccoli eaten up by something. And that doesn't mean that, like you cannot harvest it and, like cook it and eat it, right? I grew up in Colombia. There are a lot of fruits that we know that are grubs inside them because they are part of the development of that fruit. And we're perfectly fine eating fruits with grubs.
So antiphagy, is that it?
Well, yes, but like for example, guayaba is, I don't know if there is a translation for that fruit. There are always like fly grubs, in those fruits. And we make juices and we eat, like the fruits, like, and like it's kind of in our brains that you expect to find grubs in your fruit, and that's perfectly fine. For example, with blueberries and raspberries, since the arrival of a spotted winged Drosophila, the growers are having to spray way more than they used to 10 years ago, just because, like the consumer cannot see, anything in the fruit. And so if they have that problem, they're not going to be able to market the fruit, right? And so I think it is easy to blame, one side, but really, like the problem of the pesticide practices is really well ingrained in like all aspects of, like the food chain, production, pesticide companies, like regulators and consumers.
Don't tell anybody how figs are pollinated.
Exactly, right? Exactly.
Right.
Aidan,
No,
you got it.
in my yard, when we got raspberries or blackberries, if you see the little spotted wing drosophila, a little larva on top, then you pick it up. Otherwise, you just eat. Okay.
Yes.
And I don't notice they taste nutty or anything.
It's extra protein, and the taste doesn't change. I agree with you, Dave. So
Okay, so
the consumer side is a big issue for sure. I mean, another good example is in pears. They spray a lot of pesticides to control a scale insect that doesn't even, it's not on the fruit, but it produces honeydew that drips on the fruit and it can cause like a black spot on the fruit. So it's not even that the insect is damaging the fruit directly. So indirectly, it can cause a little black spot on the fruit. And then that makes it not marketable, right? So the huge amount of pesticide applications, and it's really just a cosmetic thing on the surface of the fruit. And
so Brandon, is there any avenue where the consumers can ask their grocery, where's your ugly fruit section?
That's kind of what we need. I saw them throwing out huge numbers of apples because they have sun scald on it, and that's just where like the sun hits the apple while it's growing on the tree and causes a blemish, and they're just throwing it on the ground, or the pickers are instructed to just leave it on the tree. So it's like this massive amount of food waste because the sun gave it a little bit of color on one shoulder of the apple or something.
And I'm not dissing Costco or these big, but their demand for perfection, or cherries, huge. We're throwing a want of perfection that I think drives down to the ultimate farmer, that it's tough to comply. And they're the ones that if they fail because someone didn't pick their cherries were nine row instead of 7 row, the size of it there, then they lose their entire crop that year. So then they have to sell to someone bigger that can absorb, and it's just like, okay, yeah. So that was a negative. The consumers, ultimately the people that are buying. So Margarita, you're correct. Antiphagy is the process of eating bugs, right? Not that I'm having chirps or anything, but relax. And can the consumer look for messaging that would influence the ultimate buyer? Are those two solutions? And then in yard, let things go.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably a big player, and I think it's the same principle of the things that like Dave and Aidan were discussing about the perfect lawn, right? Like we need to understand that food production is not something clean and sterile, right? I mean, think about honey, right? Like honey is nectar which has been stored in the stomach of the bee, and it's vomit, right? That doesn't make it any less delicious or yucky or disgusting. It's just this idea that because we see food in the grocery store perfectly packaged in plastic and clean. I mean, that's just not how food is produced, and so it's kind of a shift in our mindset about what is edible and not.
Yeah, and like using your own yard as like we all know that like grass is basically an ecological dead zone. So it's like that's all space for potential food as well in itself. Like you can plant your own food, or like use like there are trees in cities that grow food that people might not even know about, like whether that be apples or like nuts or something. But all of that like ecological dead zone that is lawns can be used in order to grow food, which then in itself promotes native pollinators. So, and
there's less mowing, and there's less watering, and there's less. Okay, how about climate change? What can our viewers do with climate change? Sit back and watch it go?
Oh God.
Okay, I'm going to limited. I mean, what do we? It's so big that who can do anything other than what?
I think part of it is like accepting that a certain degree of it is going to happen regardless of what we do, and being able to like, okay, how do we like limit the damage? And part of that, if we're speaking like about particularly like the phenology aspect of it, is like planting flowers that you know are going to be blooming like overlapping throughout the year. Um, so if you're planting native flowers that will bloom at different times and provide constant pollinator habitat, that is going to be one of the ways you can like limit the damage that will be caused by climate change. Yeah.
Education. I'm always an advocate. If I'm putting my bees out, we're telling our neighbors, if I think they're spraying, we're giving advice of, while my bees are flying for the next 6 to 8 weeks, could you please refrain from spraying? So education of chemicals is, starts in that little bubble and then expands. And I think whoever the viewers are here thinking through climate change, I don't have an answer. It frustrates me, but it's like, other than Aidan, grow as much as you can for as long as you can and be an oasis, and then talk with your neighbors, right? I mean, that's not impacting agriculture. What if you hear people looking at the sequoias and thinking through moving sequoias up north to start growing, because this takes so long to grow. What about planting plants from a lower zone and just start introducing those to your yard? I mean,
that will likely, I mean, this is something that, researchers are actively working on. Blueberries that were grown in northern latitudes are no longer adapted to the, springs, the temperatures in the spring that we have. So yeah, we are going to have to use the existing diversity of cultivars to, start kind of like managing these rapid changes in climate.
Okay. We've gone on for an hour, so let's you've got a point, Aidan, that you want to bring up. What is that point that you want? What is your strongest piece you want your viewers to consider? It can be anything.
I think just at a basic level is like understanding the diversity. I think I always forget sometimes like who my audience is, like especially when I just talk to friends or just random people about bees. The first thing they like show surprise at is even the fact that there are, in Washington over 700 species of bees. I would hope that people's takeaway would be like, there are so many different types of bees that have evolved in tandem with like an equally diverse number of plants and other animals, and that it's not a simple thing. It's not a simple like system of just like bees are this thing that do this. It's like, no, there are so many different relationships that some are like obligate, like species that rely on each other. Others are like so complex that we have no idea at this point. But just be inquisitive about like what you see. Look closely at like the insects that are flying around you and observe their behavior and learn about them.
Brandon.
I don't, listening to Aidan talk, I mean, I think the thing I'd like to finish with or something is what I see, that like inquisitive nature, and that what I see is it being like the kids. So we have kids that come through the lab and through the entomology department, and they are fascinated with these insects. They're not like immediately like squeamish of the things, and they're great observers. And so you talking about your yard and having these like insects interact and one eats the other and this control. Kids love that stuff. And so I just hope that, like for the future, these kids, find that fascination and then don't lose it as they get older. And so they're the ones that are going to be managing farms and, taking over the housing market and deciding whether or not to grow these massive lawns or not. And so I just hope that that is the direction things go with these young kids that see a lot more of this type of communication. And I don't remember hearing about this when I was a kid, so
No.
hopefully hopefully the future generation, I know that sounds like right a little
Kick
too
the can.
That's sort of my biggest hope, I think.
Margarita?
Yeah, I guess I would like to. I agree with both Aidan and Brandon. I also think I'm trying to become I'm generally very optimistic, but I think these the climate situation is making me very negative about what is coming up. I want to believe that the aggregate of individual actions can have an impact on what is coming up, right? We are all seeing climate change happening in front of us. When I was a kid, climate change was something that maybe my great grandchildren would see, and we are experiencing it now. So your individual choices for what to buy, reduce food waste, reduce your carbon footprint, do the best of your ability, and as a consumer try to drive what it is being offered. I think all of these actions in aggregate is going to help not only bees but everyone.
And for me, and touching the cavity nesters, the world isn't about just Osmia lignaria or cornifrons or the leafcutter. There could be 1,000 different species of cavity nesting bees. A lot of them would be cuckoo. I accept that one, Margarita. Thank you for that. But to throw into a yard in if you're playing a bee hotel, just don't. It's not full of everything. It's small, medium, and larges interspersed between sticks and stuff. Just make it messy, but make it attractive and available. I think so. When I am now carrying, I see things going in there. My eyes are a little more open, and I might start looking at my yard and talking with my neighbors. And so I always think this little house is a gateway to the 101s of look, I can take care of something. Well, now I'm looking around my yard. What should this thing be flying on? I think it progresses that way. So there you go. This was wonderful. This was exactly, we want to get a lot of fun people together. Thank you for your time. We're honored. Aidan, Margarita, Brandon, thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for organizing it. It was good to see you.
Thank you, Dave. And happy bee day, I guess.
Yeah, happy bee day. That's exactly it. Thanks, Julie, for putting this together.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. As we said, we know your time is important, so thank you for helping us celebrate World Bee Day. For everyone watching, the panelists, their work and their projects are going to be listed below, so you can see what they're doing. And if you like this live stream and you want more content like this, please do the things: the like, share, follow, comment, and happy Bee Day, everyone.
Bye.